another live streaming chat. Today I'm going to be talking to the lovely, the wonderful Hazel Soan, and I'm so excited for you to meet her and to see her beautiful art, and here's the great advice that she has for you about sketching people and wildlife. I'm going to just read you a little bio for Hazel. Hazel Soan is a gifted British artist currently working and calling in from her studio in South Africa. She paints in watercolor and oil and is the author of Learn to Paint People Quickly, this fabulous book, and about 15 other books. And she's held more than 20 solo exhibitions, and she's had her own television series called Splash of Color on Anglia TV. She has traveled and painted her way all over the world. Welcome, Hazel. Let's bring her into this call. There she is. Welcome, Hazel.
Hello.
So, Hazel, we're going to talk today about putting people and wildlife in people's sketches. And you're an expert in this area. My goodness, when I look at your art, it's just so fantastic. You're so great at it. Why do you think it's important to put people in our sketches?
It is important, I think, because people are probably the most fascinating subject, and I think most people want to be able to paint people and to put them into their landscapes. I mean, obviously the landscape's fine without people, but it does bring life into landscape paintings, and it does bring colour, because you can add a splash of red in a jersey into an otherwise green landscape. So it's really nice to feel confident that you can do so. And the reason I've included people and wildlife together is that both move. And I think that this is the real issue, is that because people and animals move, that's wherein the challenge is, and where there's a bit of sort of daunting fear sometimes, which stops people doing it. So I'm hoping that by the end of this chat, they'll feel utterly confident that they can have a go to use the watercolour brush to quickly place their figures or animals into their paintings.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think it's because people are moving, and it's hard to predict sometimes where they're going to go. And so I think people just kind of freeze and say, oh, never mind, I'll just make it an empty landscape. So maybe should we look at your sketches and you can give us some advice about how to do that?
Yes, I think the best way is always an image speaks 1,000 words. So if we can use the images I've chosen them for various reasons. So I'll try and sort of point out what it is that each one's been chosen for. Yeah, there we are. Right. Now, I put the tortoise on first because basically this is a nice slow-moving animal. And that is what people and animals normally aren't. So that's really just a sort of intro watercolour. Let's move straight on to the next picture, because what I want to highlight is the beauty of watercolour over line is that you are painting area, and so it's a very quick method of making your sketches. So if you look at the turquoise woman in the middle there, she is actually line painted with watercolour. So the brush is painted line. Now look to the lady in red, and she is painted with watercolour, which is painted in patches. So in other words, instead of painting line, you're painting shape. And this is what the brush can do that the pencil can't do. And that's why it makes it faster. So what I'm not saying don't use a pencil, because you'll find later on there'll be sketches where you do need a pencil. But what I'm saying is that don't be afraid to go straight in with the brush. So the first things we're going to look at are where I just go straight in with the brush, no pencil drawing, to show you just how possible it is and just how quickly you can capture, if that's the word, moving subjects.
Right.
So this is a typical page from this is a big sheet of paper. So it's a typical page when I'm out sitting somewhere painting figures. And usually I pick squares, or piazzas or wherever in Europe, or promenades or wide spaces, because what you need to do when you're painting people is you can't be too close to them. If you're too close, they're moving too fast across your vision. Yeah. So you can't get them. So they need to be a distance away from you, especially if they're coming towards you, because then they're on the same plane. So if they're coming towards you, so let's take the man there more or less in the middle with the turquoise shirt with the brown trousers. He's coming towards me, so I have a long time in which to see this figure shape. He's walking straight towards me. In this instance, I've chosen when the two legs are together rather than apart, because if they're coming towards you, there's not going to be a huge gap between them. And usually you can very quickly indicate somebody walking by just 1 foot higher than the other. Simple as that.
Right.
So the woman beside him, to the right of him, now she's walking. Now, again, if she was close to you, somebody walking, it's very hard to see really even what's happening very quickly. So if they're far away from you, you've got quite a lot of steps. And when someone walks, they're either usually doing the big V, which is that lady there where you've got the whole V right up to her skirt. Or if you go down below the man with the turquoise shirt on, you've got the half V where the bend is at the knee. So you've got basically in the walking figure, you're looking for 2 triangles. So the brush can so quickly make these shapes. Quicker than the pencil. So what we're going to look at basically in the series of pictures is basically to give you confidence to sketch figures from life and not to be afraid of all manner of shapes and forms. And I'm going to explain various ways to do it and basically how I do it.
Yeah, so basically you're saying to forget about outlining it or whatever with pencil, just charge straight in with
straight in. Basically, if you use, if you've got to reserve light, and we'll look at that later, then you do need a pencil sometimes. But if something is darker than the background, you don't need a pencil. You just can take your brush and you can, obviously the limitation is the water, because you've got to carry water. Now, there are brushes like this, which have water in them. They're not usually beautiful sable brushes like I like using, but they're perfectly acceptable. And they've got water in them. I'm not going to squirt it everywhere. Well, I suppose I can. It's got a reservoir. So you can actually use your paint. I'm going to show you how few colors you need as well. Now, this is my normal palette now, but when I first started painting, my palette was smaller than the size of a phone, a bit like this palette here on the back of my phone, which is just a phone cover, but it was smaller than that with quarter pans. So I could take it absolutely anywhere in my pocket, and I would carry my water in, you know, that when we had photographs that were slides, that were film, was in those lovely containers that had a lovely lid. Well, and they were waterproof and they were transparent, so they were perfect for carrying water around. So I would carry 2 or 3 of those in my pocket, so I could always have clean water, and I could go anywhere. And then I would just have a brush, a traveling brush, which I haven't got one with me here, but probably people know about them. They have a lid over it to protect the hairs of the brush. So have brush, have a bit of water, have paint, and you can make any amount of painting. So it might seem daunting to start with, but it isn't actually, because you just need to be able to have that facility of the water. And then the other thing to think about is do you sit or stand? If you stand, you need somewhere to plonk that water, or you've got to balance the water on your palette, which is something I sometimes do. I just balance the water on it while I paint. Because obviously, so that's very straightforward to do. But that means you've got to have some place where your painting is held, because you've got one hand with the brush, one hand with the palette. So at some point, if you're standing, you've got to have something to balance one of these items on. Or you can sit down. I always carry, I don't usually carry a stool, but I always carry a plastic bag so I can sit anywhere, however wet or damp. And what I tend to do is I put 3 little pots into this little container here, which can go anywhere and never spill. And that way I can always have clean water in these, dirty water in there, which I just pour out, and I can plonk it down anywhere with a bit of rag underneath so I can wipe my brush. So I'm completely and very quickly self-sufficient as a little painting machine.
Wow, that's fascinating. So no stool, just necessary.
Usually I carry a bag. If I'm not taking any photographs at all, then I carry a bag this size, because that's just got my, that's all I need for a big palette like that. And I don't need a big palette like that. I can carry just 3 tubes or even a teeny weeny palette. And then my water's in there, my sketch pad, if it's small, otherwise it's going to be a bigger sketch pad. And then my brushes and my rag. And basically, it's very little to have to carry around. And it's very easy to sit yourself down anywhere, so you're not encumbered. I'd hate to be encumbered by a stool. I like just to be able to plump myself out anywhere. And in my whole life, I have never yet not found somewhere to sit.
Wow.
somewhere to sit. If it
That's
isn't a step, it'll be a log or a rock or a post or a, you know, in the urban environment, there's always somewhere to sit. It's
yeah,
actually, you know, really easy. Yeah.
yeah. That's fantastic.
Right. If you notice, most of these figures have got heads and limbs. Obviously, that's how figures work, isn't it? So now I'll go on. What I wanted, I just want you to look quickly at them so you can see that sometimes they've got long trousers, sometimes they've got shorts. So in other words, you've got to have some ready way in which whatever they're wearing, whatever apparel they have on, you can quickly make it look realistic. So now let's go to the next image. Right, so each one of these, it gives you a sort of message as how I make these drawings. So here, the heads, first of all, if you look at the top left head, it's rather round. Heads are not really round, they're oval. So the first thing is a little blob for the head from the tip of the brush in an oval shape. And it doesn't have to connect with the shoulders. In fact, the gap between the head and the shoulders works like light on shoulders. So it doesn't have to, it can do, it doesn't matter if it does, doesn't matter if it doesn't. Then what I do is if it's summer painting and people have got arms and legs exposed to without any clothes on, then I paint the limbs, the arms and the legs first, and then literally then in usually light red if they're Caucasian, light red and a bit of violet, sometimes burnt umber if it's dark skinned, and then I add the clothes. So I actually don't paint from the head down, I paint head, limbs, because that gives me the action. So each one of these you can see the head and the limbs have been painted first, and if the clothes are darker than the limbs, then I just paint the whole figure like a stick figure in the colour of the flesh, and then add the paint.
Mm-hmm.
So let's go on to the next one.
I think one thing that people are likely that this is scary for them is having in their mind the idea that the person that they're putting in their sketch has to actually look like that person. Like they're obliged to make a really realistic representation of that person.
That's an interesting question, because when you're actually painting people from life, you can't even think about that because they all move so quickly that usually you might use more than one person to make one person. So you might, for example, be painting someone coming towards you along the street. He turns off, but luckily someone behind him is coming along. Totally different clothing. Nobody knows what he's wearing in your sketch. It doesn't matter what colours the clothes are. It's the movement you're trying to catch, because the figure will feel alive if it feels like it could be in action. It's actually all about the weight on the ankle, really. If you want to get your poses right, the nape of the neck, the weight is taken from the nape of the neck. So basically, if you're working very quickly, if you can make sure that if they are taking the weight on one leg, it's beneath the nape of the neck. But the truth is, you don't have time to even think about that when you're sketching from life, because you're trying to paint so fast and so hurriedly because you want to get something in before the person disappears.
Right.
That you don't think you worry about it looking like the person once you're painting. You might worry about it before you paint, but once you're painting, you're more worried that it looks like a person and that it's in proportion.
Right.
So I would say, worry more about having the head not too big. If the head's big, it will look like a child, because children's heads are bigger in proportion. If the head's too small, you can always increase it upwards, so that's not a problem. So it's more the aim should be the movement, that they feel lively rather than static.
Right. Yeah. Cool. All right. We'll move on to this next one. I think what you're saying is that people just, you have to have a mantra in your head that says, this is not a portrait. This is just an amalgam, maybe, of a lot of people. You're just putting people in the sketch, not a specific person.
I think if you think the word figure rather than people, figure, because if you think the word figure, it immediately takes it away from being a particular person.
Oh,
and out in your paintings, it's going to be figures. They don't have to be actual people to bring life to a painting. When you do want actual people, you'll be surprised if you get practice at this. You can tell by someone's body language in the sketch. It's amazing. I mean, people will recognize, well, sometimes I do a whole load of sketches and the people around me will say, oh, that's so-and-so, and that's so-and-so, and that's, they recognize, because you get used to seeing body language. But I think the first thing is not to worry about that. That will just come, that comes by practice anyway.
Yeah.
Now, I was going to say, you said something then, and I thought that was very...
Well, what you just said is think about putting figures in your sketch and not people, specific people, which is really great advice.
And I also think that's probably come for me a lot from painting in the bush and wild animals, because I learned very quickly that, for example, a springbok was painted not from one springbok in the end, but from several in the herd, that if once I'd got the limbs at the front limb, or even just one limb in, or the head in, I had to then find another springbok making the same pose. And so ultimately, several springbok had been looked at, observed, to make the one that ended up on my paper. And in a way, people are herd animals in that same way. So you, the thing that will attract you to a figure is often the colouring of the clothing, rather than the pose. So that you can retain in your head. And then once they've gone through, if somebody else passes by, they're going to walk in a similar way, because we all walk in a similar way.
Right.
So ultimately, I think it's in the doing of it, you lose the fear of it completely, which is the same with most things, isn't it?
Well, that's fantastic. So this,
now this is it right now. So here is a close-up of this business of doing the limbs and the head first. So this is light red. I find a marvelous color for Caucasian light skin color, because nearly always I'm painting with the light behind the figures or above the figures, because that means I haven't got to worry about light. We'll be looking at when things are lit, but it's much easier to paint something where the light is either behind or above, because then you haven't got to worry about leaving any light out of it. So therefore you can just go straight in with the whole shape. So here I will have painted the head and the neck, and the neck, something one often forgets when you paint a head, because neckline, especially if people have got sleeveless outfits or shorts on, they're bound to have probably low necklines as well. So when you paint the head, bit of neckline, then the limbs are painted, and then the legs are painted right down from the waist, but I don't want that colour to contaminate the turquoise. So immediately then, I usually use one brush, I just rinse it out. I don't usually use several brushes because it just takes too long. I usually just rinse the brush out and then dive into the turquoise and paint the torso and let it meet the wet paint, the wet light red paint, so that they blend. And the blending of the paint is what gives it the life. If the colour doesn't blend very well, they tend to look static. And the whole idea really is to try and do them, I mean, you have to do them fast anyway, because they're people moving. But if you can do it fast and not worry too much about perfection, the watercolour will become so charming just in itself that becomes, the appearance of the watercolour becomes more important really than the likeness to a figure, the likeness to a person.
Mm-hmm. And I think when it's a little bit blurry, you don't have a sharp edge, between the edge of the sleeves of the shirt and the arm and so on. It works even better, especially if these figures are in the background, because you don't want that really sharp detail anyway.
The only time you want sharpness is in the light. So we will talk, and in this one actually you can see that he is lit from his left-hand side, which is the right-hand side of the picture. You can see the bit of light down the strip of his shoulder here. I mean, you can leave, slithers of light anywhere, but we'll talk more about that when we go further on. If you just flip to the next one, there's two, I think it's hockey figures. So these people are moving fast. This was years ago when my son was playing hockey. Really, really quick, but again, same principle, using the light red to get the limbs in, and then ultramarine blue, first pale and then darker. So very quick again to sketch, and very possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to do it really quickly. And you really see a lot of life, a lot of energy.
I think that's what the watercolor, whereas if you were to draw them first, I think they would be more static. There's something about the watercolor brush that is so lively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just going to read you a comment, Hazel, from somebody here who's from Claire Putnam, who's saying, Hazel, I'm so happy to see you live because you're my favorite watercolorist, and I think I have all your books and adore your paintings and your loose, spontaneous style.
Oh, thank you.
What are we looking at here, Hazel?
So here's another page of done in a square, I think Venice, I think this time, and just to show putting people together. So obviously you don't have to paint people just on their own all the time. You can paint groups of people, pairs of people, figures holding hands, people pulling their dog or carrying a bag. So there is so much variety in people. And I think what happens sometimes if you go out to paint figures is you get stuck into a rut of just painting one figure after another because you're trying to get that perfect image that you think you're trying to get, or you might be trying to get something lively and you keep on doing the same old pose. But that's not the way to learn. The way to learn is actually to take lots of different combinations, and that way you start to lose your fear for any of them. If you look, I mean, if you look at, you know, there's some here that don't work at all, and some that do. It doesn't matter. It's just, I'm just sketching people because of the love of sketching. There's no, you know, they're not going to end up as paintings anywhere. It's not going to end up, you know, it stays in a drawer. But I'm just painting for the love of it and learning all the time. And one or two might have that little frisson, and often they end up in books. I think the figure, the guy with the background of the Venetian red behind him, he did end up as something I pointed out in a book. So these things happen.
So I don't want to jump ahead, so I don't know where you're going, but I just want to ask you about M and W. Are you going to talk about that?
Yes. Now here, the two little figures on the far right, midway down, who look like guys with waiters. That is a friend of mine called Ian King told me years ago that if you ever don't know what to do, how to get a figure into a painting, then you just do a swift M. I'm going to draw it with my fingers like that, a swift M, a sort of broad M like that, so that arms and the V shape of this waiter sort of outfit are the top M, and then a thin W. So the W underneath is the legs, and you just let them meet in the middle. And that's what, and then you put a dot on the top, and that's what's created those characters, this M and W. I think somebody came by and I was demonstrating how you can do a quick figure to them. I think that's why they're there in the corner.
Yeah, it's such a great little trick that I read about in your book, Learn to Say People Quickly. And I read that and I thought, that's so brilliant. So can you talk a little bit, maybe I'm jumping ahead, I don't want to. Are you going to talk a bit about proportion, body proportion and shape?
Yes, just go on to, yes, we'll just look at, well, actually we could do proportions here, but again, basically the average person is about, their head is 7:1, but obviously everybody's different, and the secret really is usually to elongate rather than make squatter, because if you elongate, you can actually fatten the whole image out with watercolor. It's still wet, so you can actually broaden it. If you make people too squat, you usually end up with, you can't really stretch the legs longer and you can't make the head at all. So this is really, if in doubt, elongate is what I would say. Certainly make the head an oval, and the arms come down, basically they're just level with the thighs when they drop down below, but you're usually moving. And so in any painting, in a way, you probably don't even have to worry about the arms, just don't make them too long, obviously. In a way, legs can be any length, because with watercolor, you can very quickly wipe it off. So if you did do them too long, you can just grab a bit of rag and you can drag it off quickly. Or even, I sometimes just take my finger and I just, not even licking it, I just push the paint and it becomes the shadow. So in other words, you move the paint aside.
Yeah.
But again, it is by looking at the people. I think the main thing people get wrong is they get the heads too big. And I would say if you use the brush, decide what size you're going to paint. This is a sheet of paper that I think is about 60 by 20. And I think the brush I was using was a size 8, because when I press that down, just pressing onto the paper, that's the size of the heads.
Yeah.
And so that means you've got some kind of control over your scale. If you use too big a brush when you want to paint small, it'll make it too difficult. If you use too small a brush,
Yeah.
they'll end up tiny because you have to do too many brush strokes. And the whole point here is we're trying to make as minimum number of brush strokes to make these figures work.
Okay, cool, cool. I have a couple comments here. Barbara Gucci, hi Barbara, is asking Hazel, when do you put your figures in your paintings? At the beginning of your paintings or at the end? And she says,
Oh, she's jumping ahead here. We're coming to that. We're coming to
oh, okay. All right.
that.
So Barbara, she's going to answer that question in a moment. And I have another one from Claire. She says, what amazes me is Hazel's ability to put two colors still damp on an image side by side, allowing them to blend just enough without getting muddy.
Well, we're going to talk about that as well.
Okay.
So I think I'll hold, if you can wait patiently, we'll get to, I'm hoping I'm going to cover all the various things people might ask by the time we get to the end. So we'll get there and keep the questions coming, because then I know that it's, that's what you need to know. This little picture is in here. This is in Tunisia. Because I want to show the grouping. It's really fun once you get more confident in painting single figures to group figures together. And obviously, in this instance, the figure on the figures on the left are one group, and actually the man was a separate figure. But in fact, they could still be the same set of figures. But basically, because the woman on the left with the boy has been painted first, and then the darker figure behind her. And so in other words, they're not painted all together. They're each painted individually. So it's the same process as before, putting in one color. And in this case, because they're wearing robes, actually they're just painted, the whole robe is just painted. And then the folds in the robe is actually what's been added into the wash in the figures on the left-hand side. Mm-hmm. So one doesn't ever try, I would never try, because I want to keep the paint wet. I would never try to paint the lady on the left and then the lady with the headscarf. I wouldn't just do that. I would still just do one figure at a time. She's obviously painted with the boy that she's holding the hand of, and then the next figure's beside. And so in terms of a time frame, each figure's probably taken a few seconds to paint, but there's probably 15 minutes have passed before those four figures are in, and they're all long gone and disappeared. And there was never a moment when that was a real situation.
Right. You know what? I love this shadowy person in the middle. The folds of the robe. It's just gorgeous, and it's just there's no details, there's no face, there's no hands or anything, but you know exactly what it is. It's just so lovely, so well done.
That I think the beauty of watercolor is that it's this mantra: less is more.
Yeah.
You can do so little with watercolor and say so much, and mm-hmm. I still find it miraculous. It still leaves me in wonder now. I mean, to this day.
Yeah. Well, your enthusiasm is infectious. I just have a question about hands and feet. So this woman in the middle who's walking towards us with the white scarf, so you haven't worried about her feet or her shoes or anything like that, and it doesn't matter, does it?
No, and absolutely. If they're coming towards you, forget about feet. A shadow is a really useful thing. So if the sun is shining, a shadow anchors them very nicely to the ground. Mm-hmm. And if they're coming towards you, you really mustn't think about feet, because you actually make them look rather plonky, really. Yeah, I mean, they tend to look toy town. If they are going sideways, let's go back. There were some sideways people in the one before. I usually don't worry too much about feet if they're far away. There will be some where the feet do. Let me just go to the side. Which one? The one we went. Never mind. Yes, here we are. No, I don't think I've worried about feet. I think the only one when there's a bit of a foot is that woman running with the bag on the bottom left. There's a bit of a bent foot because that's sort of, she was taking her weight on it. But otherwise, even the sideways ones, I haven't really worried. I don't tend to worry about feet, but there will be one or two later that we'll see where I do. So there's a monk coming up where his feet matter. So we'll, but absolutely, you're absolutely right. And hands, I do lift the brush off just at the end of the hand so that you get a slight blob, but it's teeny weeny, which can be seen as a bit of a hand, but I don't think about it.
It's not
You know, but I am aware of it. I mean, that woman pulling her push cart, it looks like a bit like a golf club she's pulling. You can see there's just where the hand's been pushed off, where the end of the hand is, the brush has just been lifted off. It just leaves a little bit more because there was a little bit of pressure before it lifted, and so it deposits a bit more paint.
Yeah.
But kind of things, you don't have to think about those things. You'll find you just do them, you know, if you think about it, it'll all become too contrived. It's
Right.
got to be terribly natural. The woman down the bottom right, you can see her hand just at the end of her blouse. It's just a blob. And the more blobby, the less you try and make it look like a hand or a foot, the more it will look like a hand or a foot. That's the bizarre thing about watercolor.
Oh. I have a question here from Romana Davies, and she's asking, which light red do you use for the skin color?
Well, I think some of these are, now I use mostly Schminke colors. So I use, their light red is called pot soily earth. But basically light red is the opaque version of burnt sienna. So it doesn't matter what brand you're using, you want the opaque version of the burnt sienna. So Venetian red, Indian red are all a bit dark, but you could still use them. A lot of the, this sketch, I think the light red was Winsor & Newton, but it might be pot soily earth. Difficult to remember, but I've tended now to use all Schmink bar one or two colors because I find them the most wonderful brand.
Yeah.
And here in that one, the one before, the Tunisian one, I don't think I used light red. Now here, again, with African figures, I don't use light red because it's too pale. So here is burnt sienna and ultramarine blue together, or burnt sienna and violet together. I think in these actually it isn't violet, it's burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. But now the reason I put this little group in, again, each one of these has been painted individually. The group in the middle did hold together. The group in the middle were standing around, so they actually are, you know, real actual group of people hanging around together. But the two on the sides, neither at any one time were these 5 people in association with each other, but they are in my painting. And the reason I include this one is because of the beauty of light. Now, if you look at the women in the middle and you look at the arms, you'll see little slithers of light on the top of their arms. And that white light is so useful because it means you can divide your painting colors. So the one on the left, she's red at the top, yellow sarong underneath. The one on the right, it's more to give us the feeling of her hands being behind her, back of her. Doesn't really matter in terms of color because she's wearing the same costume. But it gives you a breathing space for your colors. And so, whereas I love colors to blend together because that gives them movement, and also watercolor, color in shadow, you tend to want it to blend together. As soon as figures are lit, there are going to be these lozenges of light. We're going to talk about them more again later. So that's really, I just wanted to introduce that at the beginning with these little groups of figures which weren't really in settings. So now we'll just talk about the animals, which really and truly the subject matter, you know, animals and people are the same for a watercolor's concerns because watercolors are flat. They're just patches of color on pieces of paper. So in terms of watercolor, it knows no difference between a human and an animal or a landscape or a rock or anything. So the same process here, you just see a page from a sketch, but you can see on the left, I've just been looking at the shapes. So just using one color of the watercolor. And then when I feel I've got an idea what the shapes are like, and wildebeest are the oddest shapes on the planet, I can tell you. Then I get braver and then I use a pale undershape. So in this case, yellow ochre. And then I drop in ultramarine or burnt sienna to start to model them. So it's the same kind of thing as with people, but it's the whole shape this time and all the legs, because I find it, if I don't get the whole shape in right at the beginning, I find it quite difficult to remember, you know, what was the shape basically. So I use a light color to start with, get the shape, and then while it's still wet, drop in the deeper colors. And again, you can do it very quickly, but it takes, again, you know, it takes lots of painting to get confident.
Yeah, yeah. I think, you know, you're so talented. You know, you accomplished the people, and then you said, okay, what weird shape animal can I go with next? So that you gave a little challenge to yourself.
It's not so much like that. I basically, it was actually the African bush that taught me to paint watercolor quickly, because I was painting in the bush. It was very hot, so it was drying fast. So I had to find a technique that could work in the bush to my satisfaction. But the beauty of it drying fast did mean I could paint a lot.
Yeah.
And cover paper. And I've never seen anything as any different subject matter. To me, the subject matter is light, or it's the shape. So I don't see figures or animals as any different shape. And while wildebeest are an odd shape compared to lots of other animals, in a way, the challenge is the same, because anything that's new to you is going to be an odd shape. So the first time you paint an elephant, it's odd. Once you've painted hundreds of elephants like I have now, I don't see it odd anymore, because I'm familiar with it.
Right.
Once you paint, when you first paint your first figures, they're going to be odd if you haven't been used to painting without drawing first, because you're going to feel out of your comfort zone. But as soon as you do it, I mean, it really doesn't take actually, any one session. People, when I've taught people, they've been amazed at what they've achieved within their sort of their first figures. A little bit watery and a little bit nebulous, and usually got a big head and usually got big feet at the bottom. And then about 3 figures in, and
a big improvement.
I mean, like massive improvement, to the point, where they suddenly think, oh my goodness, I can do it. How come it took her so many years?
You just have to put in your 10,000 hours, I guess, and get some tips from a professional.
Yeah, but I think the thing with watercolor is, because watercolor is such a beautiful medium, it will reward you quicker than any other in terms of these quick sketches. It's a different matter when you're putting it into settings, because once composition gets involved, that requires a lot more skill. But for quick sketches, if you get confident in the medium and don't try and control it too much, and don't try and tell it off, and don't try and push it around too much, it will reward you. It is a very, very, it's not the unforgiving medium people think if you don't overwork it. It's a very kind medium.
Cool.
Yeah. Now here, I've included these penguins partly because they're here in Cape Town near me, but because you can really see the brush stroke here. You can see that this brush will have painted, this piece of paper is about 16 by 12, something like that. So the size of each of these flippers is about, well, I can tell you the size, it's exactly the same size as the head of this brush, because literally I have made the flippers with one brush stroke, with that brush loaded, in this case with indigo and sepia, I think, mixed together. So if I want to paint on a bigger sheet of paper, then I just need a bigger brush so that I can make a bigger flipper. And if I want to paint smaller, then it's got to be a smaller brush, because obviously I want to be able to do the stroke with one stroke. The whole thing is a sort of, I almost think it's like time of motions. It's got to be efficient if it's going to be quick. So you don't want to be having to do 2 strokes to make one flipper. And then same with the back of the penguin. The penguin are just like people, really. And here we do need feet on these little penguins, as you can see.
Yeah.
The sort of joined up stroke that makes the back. So if you look, say, the second one in from the top, the beak is the tip of the brush pointed, and then tip of the brush again comes down from the top of his head. The brush is pushed down onto the paper to make the brushstroke thicker for the body, and then goes thin again to be, in fact, I probably reloaded to do the two flippers at the side.
Yeah. Somebody has asked a question here, which I think is we're sort of talking around that. This is Phoebe Wilson, is saying, how big do you typically paint people, and maybe the figures of animals as well? So she says, you talked about the size of the paper and the brush, but not the size of the people in terms of inches or millimeters, or how you're just putting figures in the background. So
well, basically it will depend. I mean, when we come to where I'm showing them in settings, which we're coming to shortly, then you'll see it's different proportions for the different landscape settings. So if your piece of, if your landscape is that size, and you want tiny figures, then they might be only, they might only be that tall. But if you
Yeah.
want the figures to be bigger, now I would say these are all what I would call figures rather than specific people. So they're never going to be huge, because if they were too big, they'd have to then have a bit more specificity about them, or be treated differently. But right at the end, I am going to show you using the method big, because I just love this whole sort of image of the quick sketch. But the size really is down to the brush. Whatever size brush I'm using is what ends up being the figure, and also to do with how far away they are, because one tends to work sight size. If you're not trying to make a painting, if these are just sketches, I'm not trying to make a painting at this stage, we're going into that as we move on. One tends to work sight size. So a lot of it's to do with the brush, but a lot of it is just to do with how far away they are when you paint, and also the size of the paper you're working on, the size of your sketchbook.
Right.
Here's another page from a sketchbook. I mean, these are just to show pages from a sketchbook. We can flick through these. But again, here, this sketchbook, I think, is a 16 by 12 again, I'd say. So those birds are, well, it depends what size your screen is, doesn't it, I suppose, as to what you see them as. But the birds themselves must be about 4 inches high, I suppose. This saddle-billed stork in the foreground is probably about 4 inches high. On that kind of piece of paper. But it's just really to show that I have so many sketchbooks, and they're filled with pages and pages of this kind of thing, which may never see the light of day again, but they are, as you say, the 10,000 hours. They're me just practicing with the paintbrush, and the thrill is in doing it. It doesn't really matter if nobody ever sees these. For me, I just love making it's a way of observing life. It's a way of seeing the world, and then sometimes one can get a little bit more complicated by putting a bit more challenged, I say, rather than complicated, by putting characters together. So a bit like with the groups of people, when you start putting animals together, then you're starting to make a painting. As soon as you're starting to make a story about it, that begins the narrative of a painting.
Right.
I think that's the end of the sketches. Now I want to talk about the process of the wet in wet paint, and then we'll come on to putting them into settings.
Okay. Do I need to go ahead to the next sketch?
Please, yes, please, yes. Next sketch. Now the next sketch should be a monk.
Yay.
Yes, it is. Right. So this has a nice, you can see the texture of the paper hopefully here. So you can see this actual, the sketch is about, he would be about 3 inches high. So he's part of a whole set of monks, but I decided I just wanted to show you one. Now here we can see the feet. Because he's sideways on and he's wearing a habit, his feet match. If you imagine, if I hadn't put feet in, it wouldn't work, would it? Because one, if you just had little spikes at the bottom, it wouldn't work. So the feet are important. So what happens is when you're painting figures, you very quickly learn what it is you need, because if you don't do it, you notice it in your sketch immediately that it didn't work. And the beauty with the whole page of figures is that it doesn't matter if some work and some don't. As long as if you've just got one or two that work, they carry the whole lot. So it doesn't matter if you've got bad pictures. You don't have to go correcting them or anything. It just, it's lovely watching someone's observation on paper. Mm-hmm. But the reason this one's here, not just so much for his feet, is to show how easy that sash, what do they call it? Not a sash, a cord.
Yeah.
What do they call that? Round, how easy it is just by leaving a gap and then a little slash across the bottom bit. We know exactly what that means, don't we? We know it's this, and it's so, you need so little to say so much that we know a lot about that monk, and yet it took seconds, not even hardly seconds, to paint that. This case, because there's hardly any limbs, I did not paint that hand and face first, that head first. I painted the body, because in this instance what I need quickly is the whole shape. I know where to find the head afterwards. If he's gone, doesn't matter. I can guess where the head is and I can guess where the hand is.
Right. So just to recap for a moment, somebody has asked me about that red paint that you mentioned. Did you say Potswellian? I've never heard of that. And they need that.
Potswellia, Pozzzueli, earth.
Ueli. Potswelli. I've never heard of that. And that is.
No. I think Schminke are a German company, and so they sometimes use different names. But they also had a burnt sienna, which was opaque. So that was quite useful. And then now they make a transparent one as well. But I mean, obviously I don't know what Daniel Smith you use a lot of, don't you, in America? And they will have an opaque burnt sienna. And I don't know what it's called. I can certainly find out and let you know.
Okay. So, and also you're painting these with around a number 8 or 10 round brush?
These are 8 or 10, yes. I mean, I suspect if this will be a 10. I think this will be a 10, this one.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah. Now here's a whole group of figures coming towards me. And the reason I show this little drawing is because they've all been painted with a dark colour. I mean, obviously 1 or 2 have got light heads on for a bit of variety, but the one on the left, the dark one on the left, the woman, they've all basically been painted with that colour, and then I have dropped into it the colours of the clothing. So the guys with the sort of burgundy jerseys on, they, underneath, they're all the colour of the lady on the left, and then the burgundy colour has been dropped in while it's still wet. And the same with the second lady in, her head and her hand have been dropped in. And this is one of the reasons why I use the light red, because it's opaque. And opaque colours in watercolour can drop into darker colours and lighten them.
Okay.
Yeah, now, so that is a
tip. I've never heard that before. Opaque colours in watercolor can drop into a darker colour and lighten it.
Yes, exactly.
That's a good tip.
And it's the same in oils. Opaque colours bring light. Cadmium red and cadmium yellow. You work on a dark ground, you bring light in with the opaque colours. But in watercolour, it's all much more obvious because mostly you're going from light to dark. So you're often adding transparent colours, one on top of the other, which darkens them. But if you then need to reintroduce light, you either need to drop water in, which is what I've done on the right-hand side to make gaps between the people, or there's that little group of figures with bits of, the paler colour is just pure water dropped in. And also the guy 3 in from the left, the 4th one in the background, I think that was probably an accident. I don't think I intended to do that, but it doesn't matter because he just ends up with paler clothing. But I can use plain water, which just pushes the colour aside and makes it lighter, or I introduce the opaque colour. And that's really, I think, why I went to the light red in the first place, was because it was opaque, and therefore I could drop it into the colours.
Yeah. So, Hazel, I think there's sort of 2 different things that happen with watercolor. One is the technical skill, but the other is forgiving yourself for your own mistakes. And it's the mental game, because I hear from my own students, often they'll say, oh, this sketch that I did is terrible, it's no good, it's awful, I don't even want to show it to anybody, and they're embarrassed and so on. And so what would you say to people, about just overcoming, this fear of failure and their expectations for how something should turn out?
Yeah, it's a very important point, this, because I think the problem is that you make a product with watercolor, therefore you can see the ones that don't work. But if you were a golfer and you were hitting thousands and thousands of balls to get better at golf, you're not going to expect every single one to go to the right place, and you're not going to mind. You're going, if you've got 50% in the right place when you're standing on the tee, not when you're playing the golf game, obviously, because that's when it matters, but when you're practicing, you're not going to mind that someone well, you are going to mind because you're trying to get them straight, but you're not going to, there's no record of it anywhere, is there? So the same with painting is that you should be prepared to cover paper. That is really it's a shame that watercolor paper is so expensive, because it's actually in covering paper with paint that you learn to paint watercolor. You cannot, and although I want to sell lots of books and lots of DVDs, you cannot learn to paint by reading lots of books and DVDs. You have to actually paint.
Yeah.
You can learn from these books, but you must go out and you have to cover paper.
Yeah.
And as you cover paper, you will, by default, make lots of things that you might term failures, but they're lessons. They're not failures, they're lessons. When we were kids, we didn't think when we were 4 that, oh, we can't do calculus, we're a failure. We were learning as we went along. And the trouble with leisure painting, I think, is that, and I'm as guilty of it as anything, is that one tries to say, do this, it's easy. And we make it look easy because we've been doing it for years or whatever. And there is an element of ease in what we're teaching because we're trying to say, look, go for it, go for it. Sometimes it will work because that's the beauty of watercolor. Sometimes it won't work. But it doesn't matter when it doesn't work. You know, I have, I don't know how many drawers full and cupboards full of supposedly failed watercolors, but they're what made me who I am.
Yeah.
You know, you just have to, it's part of it. You just have to do the next one. I mean, I think lots of people say the reason painters keep painting is because they're always disappointed with their last painting, and that's very true.
Oh, that's funny. I think I have a comment here, a question. Eileen Goldenberg is saying, people need to realize that there are no mistakes in art. So there you go. All right. And so what are we looking at here?
All right, here, if you look very closely, there is pencil line. So I'm not saying that you don't, abandon the pencil, because the pencil is obviously a very useful tool, and we'll see later when things are lit, an even more useful tool. But when you do a pencil drawing, if you can just see the pencil line in this, you can just see the pencil line around the umbrella and I think down the side of her skirt. Don't fill in your pencil lines. So if you're going to do watercolors, if you're going to do a pencil sketch before, and if it gives you confidence, especially if you've got lots of people walking around and you feel like can't go straight into the paint to start with. So you do some quick little pencil things, and then you feel brave enough to paint on top. Don't fill in your pencil lines. Use them as a guide to the proportion, but not to the shape. Let the brush stroke make the shape. Because if I had followed the pencil lines, one, I would have an edge, a pencil edge, which is an edge, it's harsh.
Yeah.
That's why I included that one, just to show you that, sometimes I use a quick pencil. Sometimes I'm not even thinking I'm going to paint, and I see something I want to paint, and I haven't had a chance to get my paints out. So I might just do a quick sketch with pencil and then come back and paint. But I will never just fill in the pencil lines because it'd just be dead as a dodo.
Yeah, cool. That's a good tip.
Now I want to talk more about this wet in wet. Now this is quite a big picture. So these were done, I think, with a size 12 brush. So these figures are, they were walking in a New York street, and they're about 8 inches high on the paper, the figures themselves. And so here, the one on the left, there was two girls together. So I needed to have them, I wanted this association with them, and they were walking away. So I had to be very quick. So I'd used large brush because I've got to do it fast. I was already painting, my watercolor paints were already wet. I couldn't really have done this if I was starting dry because I couldn't have done it quick enough, but I was already sketching other things. And then I saw these two girls, and they just had that kind of look of being, that retail therapy look of being together. And I just thought, I love that. It's important to know the paint's already wet because it does take a while to get your paints going. So you couldn't do this immediately sitting down that size because your paint wouldn't be ready enough. So the girl on basically alizarin crimson is the main color. So the girl on the left is being done completely in alizarin crimson, the whole of her. Then the girl on the right, the same, but then color is now dropped into the alizarin crimson and dark, deeper, more neat color. So if you look to the girl on the left, you can see that the alizarin crimson that darkens her is actually quite neat. So I've used quite wet color to make sure it stays wet, because we're talking big brush to make sure it stays wet. And then when I've gone to the girl beside her, I've changed that color into a violet by adding blue into it, but it was very wet. You can just see the alizarin peeking out. The bag is added, so that's not the alizarin crimson, but if you can see the color under, and then black's gone down her leg. And it looks to me like I didn't finish her legs. I think I only got as far as her coat. In the alizarin crimson, because I can't see the alizarin crimson in the legs. But basically the whole shape had to be done, and I left the space for the neck, this furry sort of collar that she's got on. I just left a space because I knew I couldn't get that in quick enough before they'd gone. Yeah. So, sometimes you've got to be ready if you're going to try and be bolder and bigger.
Right. Cool. Beautiful. Lovely.
And this next one is one of my favorite little sketches, actually, because never be afraid of the splodges of watercolor. One of the beauties of watercolor is the little backgrounds, the bits of water that background in, you know, the cauliflowers, people sometimes call them, because they are the charm. You know, to me, this watercolor is made by the bleed of the watercolor and the blur of the watercolor. That to me is the charm of it. I love the fact that the guy's head sort of splurging out into the background and the big splodge at the side. That's the beauty of the watercolor.
Yeah. So somebody is asking, Hazel, do you spray your paper? This is Suzanne is asking, do you spray your paper before?
No, the paper's dry.
Okay,
Paper's dry.
but so do you use the typical trick of spraying the little spritzing your palette?
Oh no, I'd never spray my palette. No, watercolor is so perfectly balanced with it. If you spray it when you're not using it, you will leach out all that gum arabic. No, you should. Oh no, you should never ever spray your palette. No,
Really?
you should only ever wet the watercolor that you're using. Yes. Oh, you waste. You'll end up with dead pigment in the bottom of pans, which is useless to you because you will have leached out the gum arabic.
Okay. You know what? I've seen a lot of urban sketchers, and they take the little spray bottles with them and they spritz their whole palette to kind of make the watercolor juicy. You would never do that.
No, but then don't forget, I'm not using all those colors.
Yeah.
Anyway, but you know, at any one time, I'm usually probably only using 3 colors. So I wouldn't want any of the other colors to be wet until I need them, because I want to be able to close that palette up and it not run in any way.
Right.
I only want to bring water in, which is going to leach out and dissolve the gum arabic when I need to. Otherwise, you will waste an awful lot of paint, I can tell you.
Okay. Well, you know what? I love interviewing so many different people and learning their tips. Are all so different. And when I hear a tip that's completely different, I've never heard before, it's like, oh, so exciting. Well, that's cool. Interesting. Shall we move on to the next clip? Okay. And I have another question for you from Claire is asking, would Hazel recommend her favorite warm and color primaries that you like best?
Well, funny you should say that now, because we are now going to be starting to, well, in this one, but later on with little elephants, talk about the colours, because here, this elephant is made with red, yellow and blue. And this was just meant to be a quick one on from doing the wet in wet before we talk about silhouettes. But actually now we can talk about it now, because again, like I was doing with the wildebeest, I paint the pale colour first, usually a yellow. Then I drop in my red, then I drop in my blue. And that means that also the paint, the water hasn't got dirty too quickly. So my water is only dirtied with the yellow, then dirtied with the red, then dirtied with the blue. So if I'm doing something very small and not want to use too much water, I got enough water that's clean. So the primaries will be different every time. In this case, this would have been yellow ochre, alizarin crimson and Prussian blue. But later on, we're just going to look at 3 different other color combinations of elephants, because basically red, yellow and blue make grey, make brown. So it can be any combination, and there's so many to choose from.
Right.
So now you've come to the next one. So we're going to come to settings, because this is what we're about figures in settings. So if the light is behind your figures and their silhouettes, it's a very straightforward thing. Your setting is painted here. You know, this is probably a painting that's probably about that size, and washing the colour in for the background. Here in Africa, dries very fast, and then the silhouette's just painted on top. So the whole thing is probably an 8-minute painting.
Right.
It doesn't take long to do at all, and the children are playing in the water, and they're not going to disappear for a while. There's plenty of children around, so the background needs to dry before the figures are painted on, but they're literally just one colour figures, and here it's the grouping that matters. So the 2 on the left, they actually, I remember painting this distinctly, and they stayed more or less in that position for a lot of the time because they were busy doing something in the water. The boy on the right, he was the one who moved, and so he was added in after. So the 2 figures were sort of painted together first of all, and then the boy positioned so that the composition was nice. So once you're trying to paint a whole painting, composition comes in, and that's when you've got to think a little bit more. So that's why you need to have painted dozens and dozens of figures just on sheet of paper, so you're confident with your shapes. likewise, this one again, here, including a dog. Now look at these shapes, look really closely. They're just hieroglyphics. They're not, they're really odd brush marks, aren't they? If you look at them. I picked this one because I just love the fact that the dog, what is that shape? But you know it's a dog, and you know he's carrying a stick. The men running, I mean, they're really blobby and odd. This is the beauty of the brushstroke. They're almost, Chinese hieroglyphics characters, aren't they?
Right. Yeah.
Yet they work. And the together work.
Yeah.
And you couldn't, you have to not try and be too perfect, is almost what I'm saying. Because you must let the brush dance on the paper, and it is the brush and the paint that's doing the work. You're doing it, you're facilitating it, but you're trusting it.
Yeah.
Trust it can do better than you can do. Because if I tried to make that look like a dog and make it look like running people, I can promise it wouldn't look as good as it looks.
Yeah. From looking at your book, which I will blatantly advertise right now, Learn to Paint Quickly. What I noticed in this book is that there are a lot of silhouettes, a lot of people who are silhouettes, and because they're backlit. And I realized, the beauty of adding figures to your sketch is that it just, rather than having just a flat landscape that's static, you brought some life and some energy into the sketch. But what I learned from your book is that it doesn't have to be, it shouldn't be a portrait, and it doesn't have to be, it can just be a silhouette, and the silhouette is good enough to actually bring some life and energy into a sketch, like this one.
But obviously, you can only put a silhouette into a landscape if your landscape is backlit, because it won't look right. If you were to paint right here, now here, for example, these can't be silhouettes. This skyscape I painted from my studio. I have a beautiful view of the ocean out there, and I paint the sky. The sky is beautiful. So I painted it, so there's nothing at the bottom of it. It was just a sky. And I just put it aside, I didn't look at it. And then I found it and thought, oh, I love this sky, but it doesn't make a painting on its own. It's got to have something. So then I went out onto the beach and found figures that worked for it. So they can't be silhouette, because that sky wouldn't have silhouettes in front of it, because if you can see, the light is from the right-hand side and on top, because we can see from the clouds, the volume of the clouds. So you couldn't put silhouettes onto that because it wouldn't make sense, because it isn't backlit. Right. So when I went down to the beach, I had to choose the same time of day as this was painted, and then just find some figures who I thought matched. If you look at the next slide, it's the figures are in more detail. I've just done it closer up. There we go.
Oh yeah.
So now here you can see, now if you look very closely, you can see I have pencil marked them in first, because I was putting them onto a sky wash that I really liked and I didn't want to mess it up. I did pencil wash, but again, not outlines. I just did a tiny indication just for scale and just for their position in relation to each other, because the gap between them matters as much as their shapes. So the flow, I was trying to find a nice sort of movement, and it was quite a while before, there were quite a lot of people walking on the beach, and there was lots of different things. So I did the sketches on something else before I chose who I was going to do, to find out what I wanted to do in this bottom corner. Right. And the hat is white paint on top, so that it's lighter than the background.
It's so beautiful. I'm learning from you, and I already knew this, but you just have to keep getting, hearing the message again and again to get in that art isn't about perfection and making this perfect reproduction of something that you see like a photo. In fact, there's some beauty and charm in the imperfections. And when you draw the perfect outline in pencil, then you fill it in like a coloring book, well, it's kind of.
Well, it'll be static. The problem is, what you're trying to do is you're trying to create life. A painting that works is one that has a life of its own. It becomes something of its own. It's not, it's not a copy of the world. It's a new creation. And that's the important thing. Now here, this one, and I think what's the next one? Yes, this one, and then yes, they're still talking about figures that are dark in the background. Here, the figures are painted first, no background at all. They are in a street, in this street, but the street I'm not even looking at, because I'm not going to see this again. Probably the boy pushing his brother, presumed brother, in the wheelbarrow. So I have to get in quickly paint the figures beforehand. So I haven't even thought about the background. Figures are gone, the figures are there, the real people have gone out and gone down, there's lots of other children playing. Now I have to introduce a background. So if you've got figures you've painted and you want to create a background around them, then you need to make sure you don't conflict. So the background behind the dark of the boy has to be lighter, right, or much darker. So you see where he's lit on the left-hand side, I've put a figure behind him to bring out the light on him.
Right.
On his right-hand side where he's dark, I've made sure that the house, part of the house behind him is light, even though it's the shady side of the house. So in other words, you've got to be aware that your picture matters far more than what's happening in the real world.
Right.
Now what I could have done was I could have put the light part of a building behind him, but then I wouldn't have had the option, then I'd have had only light behind him and he'd have looked haloed. So what I decided to do was just basically compose it as I did, and the reason I chose it is because I like the composition. There's plenty of times I've done it and I don't like the composition. So once you've got your figures, if you're now adding your setting, you must make sure it complements the light and dark tones of your figure.
Right. So you're really taking advantage of the light-dark contrast here. Yeah.
So here I painted the silhouettes. This is a London street, it's Regent Street. I paint a lot of figures on Regent Street. And I painted the figures I've painted in silhouette. So there's nothing else on the paper to start with, just silhouette figures, one after the other painted. As I say, they're all going to be a different time frame. No time are they all in this position. And the shadows. So on the paper would be the figures and the shadows. And then I have brought down the background behind them, leaving the halos of light, because I love painting into the light. I love halos. Mm-hmm. So I haven't in this instance painted the background first and put them on top. This time the silhouettes are painted first, then the background is added, and the foreground is light to contrast. So we've got our three major tones: dark, light and mid-tone. Any painting really needs dark and mid-tone.
So gorgeous and so attractive. And Hazel, I'm thinking, your love and preference for that halo really adds a lot to your art. I mean, that's such a wonderful little trick there that I'm sure everybody's writing it down right now. Halos. But really, it just adds so much to the whole composition, and it just adds like a sparkle. It's just so gorgeous. So
I mean, it's one of my favorite views. I just love when the sun goes down. But I think one is almost luckier in low latitude countries, in London, because you have, and you're in Canada, so you've got it too. You have a lower sun at a time when people are out and about doing things. And so you get this lovely effect, especially if you've got cities, because then you've got dark things against them. And I just love that. Hey, I love that sparkle of light against dark. It's really, it's just tone. It's just dark, light, and mid-tone, isn't it? And that's what makes a painting.
Yeah, I mean, really, this is, it looks so simple. There's just very few elements and very few colors in here. But there's so much sparkle, so much energy, so much life, and it's so attractive with that light-dark contrast. It's just gorgeous, really.
Less is more. Less is more.
More. Okay.
And then just a quickie to say, basically, if you're going to paint, if you're going to do a setting on this, you want to include people, and you want to do not be adding them, but you want it to be about the people. The children, for example, they move very quickly. So basically, in this case, I have drawn quickly their shapes and the composition so that I know where I want them to be. They're still there. They're still sitting there when I paint them. But basically, you've got to start with the figures because they are going to move. So everything else is going to stay static. So you mustn't think, oh, I'll just get the background, because the children will go. The one thing that's absolutely guaranteed is if you don't paint the focus of your painting right at the start, it will have gone by the time you paint it. So yeah. It's very important you go straight in. You don't faff around at the sides thinking, well, I'll be brave about the figures when I've done the hut, or if I do the trees first, I'll feel better and the paint. You just go straight in with the main event, because if it doesn't work, then you know not to waste time.
Yeah, and by then the children will have left anyway if you wait.
Exactly.
And that's something that I actually noticed in your book as well. And you can see here, not a lot of faces. when you've got a figure just in the background. Yes, you've done some portraits. There's some beautiful portraits, and you are a wonderful portrait artist. But when you're putting figures in, I don't see very many face details at all. And I realize it's not important. It doesn't matter. That's just like really focusing on too small of a detail.
Yeah, basically, I mean, certainly if they're in shadow, you don't see the faces anyway. But really, it's just light and dark. Have we gone back to one now? Have we gone? Oh, this is next. Oh, no, this is next. Oh, yes, no, this is what I want to come on to next. Yes, leaving light. Good, good, good. Right. So if people are lit, if they're not silhouette, if they're not backlit, they might be side lit or they might be top lit. And this is when you start to have to leave out white paper in watercolor. So now it does get more challenging. So this is where I would say, to start with, if you're a bit nervous, by all means use a pencil, but again, don't follow your lines. Here, there's no pencil here because I'm used to doing it, but basically if you look, the figure has been painted limbs first, so that's normal, and then I've gone the turquoise, which I've painted the shadow on the hat, the shirt, and the trousers, and then colour has been dropped into the trousers to change them into khaki, and then another blue used to come around the shape to differentiate to make the hat appear and the shoulder appear. And that same blue is used for the bag. Again, very quick sketch. The man actually, he was sort of standing quite still, holding his cell phone, as you can see in the pose. But long enough for me to get the shape. But the beauty of, I think, people holding cell phones tend to move slower. They're really useful. So, go for the cell phone holders.
You know what, I noticed that's really true when I was teaching a figure drawing class, that if you look at a crowd of people, more than half the people are standing in this position, looking down with their two hands, or at least one hand in front of their face holding a cell phone. They're all in that static position. So that really helps a lot if you want to add figures.
I know, it's amazing. It's really helpful.
Oh, that's funny.
And now this woman, again, this is the same kind of thing, the lozenges of light. So here, the light on both shoulders has to be brought by the background because you can't create the light without having the background. You can tell she's holding a baby just by the pose there. Very, hardly anything, just the hand and the head showing it. And then just that lozenge of light on her, as her knee comes forward. And then the shadow down the side of her skirt that tells you. So it's very little. I'm telling you very little, but you can tell that her knee comes forward, her feet here straight on because they're straight onto us, so no feet. Her shirt is lit, so there's a crisp edge between that and the green sarong below because the top of it's lit. I mean, how little, it's done in seconds, and again, but it tells you so much. I mean, we kind of know what she's up to, we know what she's doing, we almost know, it's amazing. I just find it amazing what watercolour can do.
So cool. Oh my goodness.
Right, now you were talking about halos earlier. Now here, this is St. Mark's Square, and now it's quite difficult to paint there because they keep moving you on all the time, so you've got to paint very quickly there.
Oh yeah.
But if you sit on the steps right at the back, so that St. Mark's is, you've got a lovely long view right across the piazza, and needless to say, not now probably with coronavirus, but crowds and crowds. So here, the background is painted first, and I have just left a very raggedy edge of white indentation. So I don't know where the figures are going to go, but I have left myself lots of white space for heads to go into because I know I can fill the spaces, but I just need to make sure I have got some white space, because if I paint the colour right down to the horizon line, then I haven't got my halos. So if you imagine that the beginning of this painting was just the backdrop with a sort of a funny bottom to it.
Yeah.
If you go to the next one, I think it shows it closer so you can see more closely the raggedy edge. Right, there you can see the raggedy edge. And now there are the figures. So then the figures are now I've got my backdrop in, and now I just pick figures or groups. Here you can see I picked a pair together, and then the ones in the background, look how loosely they're painted. I mean, these are literally just marks. But the thing that makes it work is that all the light is consistently from one side. So I'm well aware where my light is. I'm well aware to leave white on their left-hand sides, isn't it? Yes, on our
Yeah.
right, on their left-hand side. And so if you go back to the main picture again, if you go back to the one before, they all work consistently together. Some of them, hardly barely exist,
Yeah.
but it creates a whole crowd, and they're just marks. So I did the two main figures, in pink and black shirts, they're done first. So I've got an anchor, because you do need to have something that makes someone know that, these are figures and they're not just marks. As soon as you've got an anchor, any repetition, our mind just immediately assumes they're figures. So you need very little. So if we go back to the other close-up one again, if you go on to the one, yeah, that's it. Just look between, they're just marks, and yet you think they're people.
Yeah.
They're not. They're not. That's the beauty. I love the art of suggestion. That's all it is, isn't it?
It's fabulous. It's so gorgeous. So you've just got, you really focused on the first, maybe these four bigger figures, and then everything behind is just little dabs of color, and that's it.
And making sure that I leave the halo on the left side, on the right, in the painting, on the right side. So making sure that I consistently leave the halos on the lit side, because then it will hold together.
Cool. That's beautiful. So beautiful. Oh, did we see him already?
No. These are just because I painted so many billions of elephants. I'm now just going to talk about lozenges of light on the animals, but we'll flick through them quicker because I think the people is more useful. But just this one and the next one, you just see these little lozenges of light that are left. So here it's the back of the elephant, the top of the head. The next one, it's the, if you flick on to the next one, it's the backs on the springbok sitting on the in the veld. And then the last one, is springbok with its bottom. It's just this white shapes, but here's a more specific white shape left out, but leaving the white out is amazingly lively in a watercolor. It's because it uses the tone of the paper, but is surrounded by color. It's an incredibly powerful tool in watercolor. So I would say it's great to do silhouettes, and I love doing silhouettes, but don't shy away from using things with light, because it's this, it's the leaving light out of a watercolor that, in a way, tells people you know what you're doing. If you look at the next one along, the next one is figures again, and you'll see that the figures are literally, all it is white left out of the wash for the shadow on this building. And that guy, his limbs and face tell you he's a figure. Now look under the table, it's just splodgy run legs and shorts, you can't, but just by leaving that little lozenge shape of white out as a hunched shoulder.
Yeah. Made all the difference.
Yeah, it just, and if you didn't have them in there, it's not as interesting a painting. Put your thumb over them and hide them.
Yeah.
And likewise, this one here. Now, these were brought in for scale. You asked at the beginning, why bring figures into paintings? And one of the reasons is, in a landscape, is scale. If you don't have the figures here, we don't know how high this waterfall is.
Mm-hmm.
This is Noel Kwame Falls. But because the figures are there, so here I did draw them in with pencil, because I was trying to make sure, and I knew again they were going to move. In fact, they sat still for ages. They were marvelous models. But they are there for scale, and that's one of the important uses of figures in painting, is to use them for scale.
Yeah. I just want to mention Eileen Goldenberg says she's been painting along as we're talking now, I suppose. And she says, I can truly see how many hours you spent practicing these figures and animals, and I'm inspired. Thank you.
Oh, good. Right, now this painting was painted again in Tunisia, and I was sitting on a road island in the middle of a very busy traffic area. And because it's obviously quite complex, I have used pencil to hold back the light paper for the light figures. Now here, the pencil is used as a guide for the brush. So I'm obeying my pencil lines a little bit more than I would if they were just sort of free-flowing against a light background, because the edge, the pencil drawing has to tell me where I must stop, for example, the wall behind them, or which is always the wall, I think, in this case, yes. So before I started painting, I had done, I had drawn in those shapes of these figures, and obviously they're not difficult shapes because they're all in robes, to just basically tell my brush, give me the confidence to know where my brush can and cannot go.
Yeah.
And so there is definitely a time, if you're trying to preserve light in watercolor, use that pencil, because otherwise it'd be very difficult to know where to, where not to paint. And you've got to be able to paint freely. You can't, if you get too fussy and edgy, you lose the expression. And any figure that was darker than the background, I didn't have to draw. So the figures under the umbrella who are dark against the light background, I didn't worry about them because I know I can add them on afterwards. And people are coming and going to a market, so you're going to have a mark, you're going to have your subject. So it's only the light figures that I had to make sure I knew where they were going to be.
Right. Cool. So beautiful. My gosh.
And now here is basically, if you don't preserve the light, this is about white paint. Now, not the ones on the right, they are white paper preserved. But the guys on the left, you can't really go in close. I didn't do a close-up of this, but the shirt, the second one in, oh, you can. Oh, brilliant.
A little bit.
Yeah. You might just be able to see the highlights on their shoulders are white paper, but the highlight down the arm and the shirt in shadow, that's white paint, because I had already painted in the background. I'd left myself little, I'm sitting on a sort of a, I don't know what you call it. It's on a promenade anyway in Porto Venere. And so I know my head heights of everybody, and I know I want to have a whole bunch of people. It's easy to do my people on the right-hand side because they're coming and going, but I want to get my background in. So I just left out, at the same height as the people on the right, some space in the background for their shoulders and heads.
Right.
But I didn't leave it out for the bodies because I didn't really know, I thought, well, I'll paint them dark. But then when I started to paint, I realized I needed them to be lighter, one of them at least, lighter than the background for it to balance. And so I've used white paint over the background so that he looks lighter. So, white paint is, and here another one, the umbrellas are what you can see more clearly, probably. The umbrella on the right is white paint painted over the background. So the whole background was painted in first. Figures are then painted in silhouette, but the brollies, which are catching the light, are painted with white paint or red. Cadmium red is a nice opaque colour as well, so that will paint on top of the lighter yellow background. Right, okay, so let's move on. Now, this little section is just going to be about mixing colours, because basically you can't have too many colours if you're going to try and paint quickly. So right. Here is an example. Here is just cadmium red and Prussian blue, just two colours. So you need to know your colours. You need to be familiar with your colours so you know what minimum colours you can mix together to get what you want out of them. Now in this instance, I want black, red and shadow colour on a white body. So I know that cadmium red and Prussian blue mixed together to make a fine black. Mm-hmm. So I just paint the whole wing. Each one is painted individually, not painted together, one at a time, and then it's made as a composition across the sketchbook. So each one is painted, as different flamingos are flying off. So the wings are painted in first, just big red slashes with a big size 10 brush. And then the blue is added on top of the red, and that's what turns it to black.
Wow.
And then the blue is then used to be the shadow of the body of the bird.
Yep.
And brought right round to under the neck. Then a tiny bit of red is dashed in under the chin. And then the red legs are just slashed down. And you have to do them so quick because they're moving so fast. Have to watch quite a bit of time and work out what they're doing. You don't have to put the legs on to start with. So if you can't work out where the legs go, you can wait. But it's really getting those wings to be, a shape that works. So that's why they go in first. I have painted countless flamingos as well. So I have a sort of, I kind of know what's going to happen. But, as we know, it can all go wrong as well. But there's
so
just two
inspiring. Really. I'm so inspired. I'm just looking at this thinking, I would like to spend a whole day painting flamingos now. I never really thought about it. But now I really want to paint flamingos with two colors, which is really incredible.
It's thrilling, and it's so possible. As soon as you make minimums, it's just so possible.
Mm-hmm.
And
Oh,
now here each again, each bird only has, I think, 3 colours, but I wanted a page full of, this is in the Kalahari again, sitting by a sort of a place where the water was coming down. So the birds were coming down to the water. So I have plenty of subject matter. And so it's a colourful page, but each bird is painted individually. And each bird has only got 3 colours. So the 2 at the top have a yellow base and then black run into them and a bit of yellow ochre or red at the top one, and so on through the birds. But again, it's this minimum 3 colours max is, really, it's different with people because they wear colourful clothes, so you can always add a colour in and that works fine. But with animals, certainly 3 colours is usually all you ever need.
yeah, that's a beautiful page. I love that. So
I love these sketchbooks. I must admit, these Cardi sketchbooks, I really highly recommend them. They're lovely. They've got big hardbacks, and they're robust. The only thing is when you're working in a vehicle, they sort of go right across the steering wheel, so you've got to be able to have a bit of room. But they're so robust, and they give you a lovely big space to work.
could you repeat the brand? Hazel, I didn't hear it.
Khadi. It might be spelled on the back of one of these. Yes, there we go.
Okay, so I guess people are calling in from all over the world, and so if you're interested in that sketchbook, it's Khadi, and you should really just look it up online, see what you can find.
They're made in India, and the paper is it's all very ecological in that they're old sort of white T-shirts that have been recycled,
Oh,
so it's long fibre cotton, so it stays wet longer. I mean, this is one of the things reason I love them is because the paper is long fibred, it stays wet longer than a normal paper.
cool.
Right, now this is just yellow ochre and violet. Yellow ochre and violet together make a lovely browny grey.
Yeah.
So just 2 colours. So again, it's fine. It's going to be opposite colours, isn't it? So with Prussian blue and red, it's red and a turquoisey colour. Here, it's violet and yellow. So your opposites are, orange and blue are a good combination, or brown and blue are a good combination. So those 2 colour combinations are nearly always going to be opposite colours. But I mean, you don't have to, things don't have to be realistically coloured. They can be any colours really. So then the next one is 3 colours again. Next one here. Now that again is my yellow ochre, alizarin crimson, Prussian blue combination, which I absolutely love. And it looks like so many more colours, doesn't it? It looks like so many more colours than just those 3.
Yeah.
Because each one, when you work with minimum colours, what you're doing is you're making the interaction between colour more powerful. If you have too many colours, you deny each individual colour its power. So the reason that watercolour is meant to be done with a limited, this is where it's different to oils, because in the transparent medium, you want a minimum number of colours because then they will each make the other colour more colourful as they interact with each other.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I've gained a new appreciation for charging in with other colors and just allowing those colors to mix on the paper rather than have a solid color here and another solid color there, another. That's kind of boring. It's much more interesting to see how those colors are playing with each other.
Well, you only need red, yellow, and blue. You can get all the colours of red, yellow, and blue. So basically, you find combinations of red, yellow, and blue. There's so many different combinations that basically you're never going to, in a lifetime, be able to get through them all.
Yeah, that's right. Wow.
Here's another now here's red, yellow, and blue, and this is 3 opaque watercolour colours. So this is cadmium yellow, cadmium red, or Scarlet Lake. I can't be sure. It might be Scarlet Lake, but I think it might be Scarlet Lake actually, and then ultramarine. No, it's cobalt blue. Yes, so it's cadmium yellow, Scarlet Lake, and cobalt blue, and makes another lovely combination. So it's just this, red, yellow, and blue. I tell you what I did remember to say, or nearly forgot to say, on my website, which is hazelsoan.com, or allsewn-up.com. There is a drop-down menu at the top called Paint with the Artist. If you go to that and click Paint with the Artist, in the drop-down menu, it's got YouTube clips. If you click on that, there is a 2-minute painting, a speed LE painting of these using these three colors. So if you want to see how these are made and want to see how the first of the outline is done, so as I'm not doing a demo on this talk, you can see very clearly on that on the website.
This guy is so cute, and you know, like it's like a whole sunrise is happening right on his back.
Well, I mean, that's, you get the reds of Africa, which is so special. And here, basically, is putting it, you know, a whole bunch of them together and showing that, you know, just within, again, this three color scheme. And this is my yellow ochre, alizarin, and Prussian blue combination, again, which I find I use a lot. How, you know, one can be redder, one can be bluer, one can be yellower. So even within a set of elephants, you don't have to make them all the same color. They can all feel different, and they'll all work together in harmony because they're only three colors. And so you're guaranteed harmony. So you can afford to make, you know, push one in the warm direction and push one in a cool direction. So it's a sort of a fail-safe as well. You know, using limited color is actually a greater freedom. It's not a limitation at all. If anything, it's giving you freedom.
It's beautiful. And I love this sort of the cloud of dust right in the middle at their feet. You know, really, you can just, so your watercolor spread, that's okay. It looks like you're running through a cloud of dust. Beautiful.
And this is the beauty of, and I mean, to be honest, you know, if you don't know where to put the feet and you're painting something in a dusty circumstance, use the dust, because you don't, you know, the dust is more as beautiful. You're making a painting. You're not trying to tell the world somebody has feet or elephants have 4 legs. You're trying to say, look how beautiful this is.
Yeah.
Lovely. And here's the three colors in a figure situation. This is New York. And so here we have we have the same color combination. It's, no, it's not, it's aureolin this time. Aureolin, alizarin crimson, and ultramarine blue. And again, so the yellow goes in first, then the pink, then the blue, and then the three colors mixed together to make the darker colors of the figures and the vehicles. And the beauty with doing it like this is that, as I mentioned before, if you haven't got a lot of water, you don't want to carry too much water, your water gets dirty in the right order. So instead of, here you know, there's always going to be plenty of people, so it doesn't matter which figures I'm going to paint. I don't have to paint them first. I've left out the halos from the background because I know I want to put figures in. So basically the figures kind of walk into the painting. So the figures, you know, I'm just going to pick any figures that are coming when I get to the figure point, because that's when I'm using the dark color and when the water itself gets muddy, and then it's no good for doing the pale background colors.
Yeah.
So it's just really management of your materials, really.
Well, it's so beautiful. I love, it's got so much sparkle, and that's such a great tip. I think that's my favorite tip from our talk today. Oh,
now, these next three paintings are huge. So these are not done from life. They're done back in my studio. But this is where I so believe in the power of the sketch that I often make my big paintings look as if I have sketched them very suddenly. So I might spend a long, long, long time trying to make it look like I did it in 5 minutes, which sounds rather bizarre. But I so believe that the immediacy of the sketch is what makes watercolor live. That if I'm like, these are big imperial size painting, even bigger, sorry, they're you know, meter wide paintings, that I deliberately paint the same way as I paint when I'm out on the street. So here I will lay, it will be indigo, would be my undercolor, very pale. So the palest bit of indigo you can see, say on the right hand guy, this is the OK Corral. This was done in Tombstone where they reenact the OK Corral. So I painted the shapes, first of all, not the heads, not the hands, but the shapes with a very pale indigo, and then I have dropped the indigo in. So this is like the monk. This is the same process as the monk. Shapes painted first, and here the feet obviously do matter because it's a lot bigger. So this is what we're saying about if it's going to go much bigger, you might need more detail.
Yeah.
And obviously, again, there is a bit of facial feature here, but the facial features are just dropped in to the wet wash so that they're not too pronounced. Now they are actual, you know, they could be actual people. They're not actual people, but I mean, they're meant to be white earth and whatever. So there are faces, because here we are now talking about figures that are, you know, this high. And so, but this is painted back in the studio. I wouldn't want, I mean, I couldn't work that big, you know, I couldn't work outside that big very easily. because obviously you'd have to, you know, without sitting at an easel or anything, you'd have to have it flat on the ground, which is not the easiest thing in the rain.
Because I have a question for you from Yelena Casal, and I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong. She's saying, would Hazel recommend learning more of animal and person anatomy for larger paintings, or would this generally be sufficient as long as you have the proportions right?
Well, this is a difficult one because basically, because I went to art college, I did learn anatomy. So I already, and even before I went to art college, I was reading and drawing from anatomy books. So I would say, yes. I mean, the more information you've got, the more you know, the more confident you can be. So any knowledge is going to be useful.
Yeah.
It's difficult for me to say because obviously I had that. If you know, if you've been to art college, you are trained in that way, and obviously that helps immensely. But yes, I would say yes. But at the same time, I would say good observation. Good observation will, you know, the information is out there if you look. So if you're really good at observation, you will learn anatomy by observation, because mostly if you're painting people with clothing on, you can't see the anatomy. But you will learn which way a leg goes and which way an arm bends and which way, you know, where the pressure, you know, where the weight lies. Or so that's a very good question. That is because
Practice as well as study.
Yeah. I mean, you do. I think to be a good watercolorist, you do need to be able to draw. But at the same time, you can make watercolors and not be able to draw. So.
There's no final answer. People have to do whatever's right for them.
Yes, and people find the thing that appeals to them. You know, if you like drawing people, the chances are you are going to look into anatomy because you like drawing people. So here, I mean, these figures, my pleasure with these figures was again to do it large, making it feel like a sketch on the hoof, but it's done large and in the studio. But it was the actual grouping. I loved the link. I loved the way the boys are linked together. You know, the whole idea was I wanted to get that camaraderie sort of thing that I really love that. Again here, limited palette like the other one, but just touching in things like the red. So basically engineer whatever you need to make, you know, the world out there doesn't necessarily offer you what you need for a painting. But as a painter, you get to know what you need. So if you've got predominantly muted colours, thankfully people, unlike animals, might suddenly have a red shirt on. Now he may not have had a red shirt on. I don't believe he had a red shirt on. I can't actually remember now in the history of all my sketches, but I know that that's going to help those greens and blues come out. So don't, you know, use what you know. You know, there are rules in painting, and if you can obey them and you can break them at will, but you know, it's this not, you know, the beauty of painting from life is that you get to copy the world but not copy it because it moves quickly, and so you make generalizations which are good. But then if you're going to make things into paintings, it may not always, they won't offer you necessarily what is picturesque or what is exactly what you need. You have to think, I need some red in here, which is one of the reasons you might add a figure into a painting. I need a contrast. I need to make this painting come alive. I need contrast.
Yeah, that's really good advice. Oh,
this is just one of my, I love looking at figures from above, and whenever I go to Venice, I go up the Campanile and I just perch myself in a little corner and spend ages. And thankfully, again, before COVID, there was plenty of people around. But this is it's just one of my favorite. And again, it's a big painting and I'm trying to make it feel like it's just a small, quick sketch. So they're done in exactly the same way that I paint figures when I'm doing them on the small scale or not making a painting. They're done with the light red first of all, and then the clothing washed in and allowed to blend. So it's exactly the same story, but much bigger.
So cool. I love this painting. I love painting looking down as well.
I don't know if you've got the light and shade book there, but it's on the front. It's on the front cover, isn't it, of the light and shade book?
Yes, I couldn't find my copy of the book for today's interview, but I have that book, and I love that book. It's beautiful.
And I love this painting. So yeah, I like So that's another one, and that's got a lot of things about painting people in it as well.
Yeah.
This is the last picture, because this was a teeny weeny small sketch of an elephant, about, I don't know, 3 inches high. And it was seen by the High Commission of the EU Commission in Windhoek. And they said, oh, wow, we would like to have that made huge and on our wall in the High Commission in the embassy in Windhoek. And to me, that's exactly what this sketching is about, is that this, how amazing that a thing 3 inches high, a teeny weeny bit of watercolour, just Prussian blue and cadmium red, same colours as the flamingos, ends up being blown up. So it's the sketch blown up. So this is, they did this as a print. So this is the sketch blown up to that size, and it still has life and power. You can see, it's not the most perfect photo, but you can see the raggedy edge of the watercolour. You can see where it's bled. To me, this is exactly why I can't help but encourage you to have the boldness just to go in straight with the paint, because you get this kind of magic, and you couldn't engineer it. I can't make it bleed in all those same places. I can't make it do it. It does it. I just have to offer it up to the paper and make it happen.
Well, I think you do add an awful lot of skill to the to the process. So is this our last sketch?
Sorry, that's the last sketch. Yeah, that's the last sketch. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks so much for chatting with us today and showing us your gorgeous sketches. And your enthusiasm is so infectious. I'm sure that people are just going to go straight out and pull out their watercolor paints right now. You're so beautiful yourself, and your paints are also so beautiful. It's just been really great to chat with you. And so I just want to thank you. Thank you, everybody, for chatting with us today and coming in and listening to our chat. I want to let you know that we have interviews coming up on September 15th. Vincent Desplanches from France is going to be talking to us about sketching mountains and landscapes. Vincent is an urban sketcher, an artist, a freelance illustrator, and he has done a lot of illustrating for children's nonfiction books, and he's an expert on mountains and landscapes. And so he's going to be chatting with us on September 15th, and then on September 28th, I'm going to be talking to Felix Scheinberger. And Felix is going to be talking about Dare to Sketch People. Felix is an illustrator and an artist, and he's a designer based in Berlin. He's the author and illustrator of urban watercolor sketching, as well as several books in German on watercolors, and he's illustrated more than 50 children's books in the last decade. So that's Felix Scheinberger on September 28th. Let me bring back Hazel. There she is. All right. Hazel, thank you so much. Do you have any last words that you'd like to share with anyone?
Yes, I do actually, because I think these are difficult times. I mean, this is sort of unprecedented in our lifetime to not be able to go out and paint, and not to have so many people around to paint. So I think, you must keep painting. Whatever happens, even if you're painting from memory or in the house or whatever, you must be letting your brush dance across the paper. It is keeping that brush going, keeping it dancing, really. Use the time to experiment with new ideas. But don't worry about trying to make paintings. Just paint.
Get out there.
Just get out there. Yeah, if you can't get out there, do it inside. But I mean, there's a cat or a dog or anything. Just to keep the brush moving. You just mustn't not be painting, basically, because it's a bit like exercise. If you get out of the habit, then you lose your confidence. Mm-hmm. And you start to get back into it again. But and I've also got a very favourite quote, which I love, which I'm going to pass on because it's an Oscar Wilde quote, which is, I really love this quote because to me it's what it's all about. Art begins where imitation ends. You don't copy what you see.
Interpret.
Yeah, exactly.
That's wonderful. I'm going to read you a couple of comments. Yelena Cassell says, Hazel inspires me every day. She's given me the push I needed for my watercolor time and time again, and I want to thank her. And also, Phoebe Wilson says, thank you so much. It's such a gift. Also, Cynthia says, she says, yes, I've had your books out, but still felt overwhelmed. It's just so wonderful to hear you talk in person. She can't wait to try. Well, that's so nice. Thank you guys for coming to our chat, and we'll see you next time. And thank you so much. Hazel.
It's been a pleasure.
Okay. Bye,
This
everyone.
was
Take care.
Bye.
Hey everyone, I hope you were inspired by this interview and learned a lot. I know I did. If you enjoyed this interview, please subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking on the red subscribe button in the bottom right corner of your screen. Thanks so much. Take care.